Shannon had some great jokes that he would toss in that were topical references, you know what I mean? But he would do them in a period way, and they always got a big like. I remember one of them was he had a little mirror that he when he was playing the Queen in Gonzago, and he'd go, "Oh, I'm too sexy for my hair," and that always got a big laugh at the time. And I don't know if that was period, but I mean, it was a great little, and
But
we
as a
had,
way of including the audience without.
yeah, right. You're not totally breaking down the fourth wall. You're kind of winking, like, hey, we all really know it's, the 20th century.
But anyway, that's the direction I'm kind of.
Yeah. Well, let's start with your formal questions.
Okay. Welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. You know, out at Fair, there are a lot of people doing a lot of things that were both sort of period and, well, quite frankly, not period. And navigating that barrier was an interesting challenge for all of us who were on stage or the street at the fair. My guest, Dave Bueche, was an expert navigator of that line, drawing laughs for decades. Well, maybe not decades, but welcome, Dave Bueche.
Maybe not drawing a lot of laughs either, but who's counting?
But before we get to that, I'm going to ask you the traditional first Fair Folk at Work question, which is, who was the person who told you there's this thing called fair, and what did they say to get you out there?
So it was a long time ago, right? We're talking about 40 years ago, I think. So I'm going to say it was probably John Fragoli. It was one of the people in the play The Murder of Gonzago, which is the dumb play from Hamlet, showing how he thinks the murder happened, which is his father was asleep in this orchard and they poured mercury in his ear, I think is the theory of how he was poisoned, right? So they put a little play on so and Hamlet can watch to see with the stepfather to see if he freaks out, like, oh, a little too close for comfort. So we took that play. It doesn't end all the way in Hamlet. It's the stepfather like leaves and there's a big moment. So it stops in the middle. We took it and ended it, like had an ending to it and actually quoted some of the lines directly out of Hamlet, which was funny when I went and saw Hamlet later in my life. I'm like, oh my God, like I know these lines. they're they're quoting Gonzago. Anyway, so that was our play. They had a narrator. That was the role I played in that one, who popped in and out and kind of set things up and had a couple gag routines. And whoever was their narrator had bombed out. So they reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to do this? You can be the narrator, Carambus. And I said, sure, why not? And I didn't give it a whole lot of thought. And I just kind of jumped in and I was friends with most of the rest of the cast. It just seemed like a fun time.
Were these theater friends or just guys you hung out with?
They were all just friends of mine. I think they all did theater. They were all from Thousand Oaks, so I think they all did theater. Like I know Shannon Derry did a lot, and I think John did some stuff. Dave Rudder. I think they all did theater at Westlake High. I did not really do a lot of or any theater at my high school, which was Chaminade, which was in the San Fernando Valley. So I kind of got to know them through a mutual friend. So they all kind of knew each other, but I was one of the gang by this point. I'd been jumped in.
Let me ask you a truly random question.
Sure.
Did you play Dungeons and Dragons with these guys?
I didn't.
Okay.
We did listen to prog rock sometimes though.
Okay.
So that's D&D adjacent.
Before they invited you to join them at Fair, what had you done with them to make them invite you to join them to Fair?
I mean, we were all kind of loudmouths and cut ups and, so I think I was a good fit for that environment. We had made videos, like drunken kind of funny videos. We did one of them was this character that I was actually the lead called the Dave Hennessy Show. And Dave Hennessy was this like cable access show that was on in Detroit, like late at night. And he'd have guests, and they're like, "Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Hennessy," and I'd be like, "Hey, everybody," and it was funny. We were so low tech that we didn't do any editing. We just would shoot a scene and turn the camera off, and then set the next scene up, turn the camera back on. But those are really funny. We made fake commercials for the Hennessy show. We had one where Dave Hennessy, he went to a haunted house. So it was like Hennessy investigates, and we had some live footage of the haunting, which was this girl Francie with a lampshade on her head, like in the distance, going like, "Ooh." We're like, "Are we getting this?" Like Shannon was filming it, and he's like shaking the camera, like it's so scary. So anyway, I'd done silly things, but nothing, I don't think, on a stage in front of an audience.
When it became that you were spending a lot of time at Faire, did mom and dad pull you aside and say, this is not quite our dream for our son's career? Or were they, we're glad that you're finally getting out of the house and not making your silly little cable TV spoof?
I don't think it was either, to tell you the truth. I think they thought it was fine. I mean, I always had a lot of friends and was always kind of in and out and into something. And they thought, oh, that's cool. They came and saw it like every season that I did it. Not when we went out to San Bernardino. They didn't come out to that. But in Agura back in the 80s, they would come one day and see the play and, walk around and have a little lunch and then split. So they were supportive, but it wasn't like their dream. It wasn't their nightmare. It was just kind of like, that's cool.
What are your earliest memories of the sensation of being out at Agura?
It's funny, it's a very physical, like, I remember the tanker that everyone used to carry around, right? Having that tied to your belt, the little with the see-through bottom.
Yeah.
And whatever you were drinking always had dust in it, and maybe a little bit of straw. I have a lot of physical memory. I remember like a couple, one of the nice things was being able to stay there and sort of party at night, like after everybody left. And I remember a couple nights when it was like a full moon and walking around and seeing your shadow in the moonlight, just, like, and it sounds really corny, but it was really like, it's a very beautiful little spot, that little valley it was in Agura. And just thinking, wow, this is kind of magical, like all these pretty girls walking around, people in costumes, and they'd have a band. And yeah, just kind of the noise of it all coming from all sorts of different directions, plays going on, and people hectoring the crowd and selling things. And it was a very physical experience, is kind of how I remember it.
It's true that it was an immersive experience. However, unlike Disneyland, which was like a really top down, everything scripted,
Mm-hmm.
the Faire was a sort of what I considered a true bottom up kind of thing. I mean, the loose parameters were set, but within that, you had the opportunity to kind of do what you wanted. Would you
Yeah, it
agree?
was, a friend of mine called it, like, that's a wiki model, right? Where everybody kind of contributes their own thing, and it comes from the crowd, as opposed to like Walt Disney had a vision and here's his stamp and this is the way it's going to go. And then there was also fun stuff that we did both at Agora and out in San Bernardino later in the day at both of them. Like, I remember Jess Winfield used to him and some other people ran a variety show kind of back in Witch's Wood, I think, that would go on at like 4 in the afternoon, when everyone was sort of reasonably lubricated, like you've had the crowd and the actors have all had a couple beers and it's not as hot, and whatever, like later in the day. And you could just think of some dumb idea, like Tim McLean and I were the Bucci Brothers acrobatic team. And we're like, hey, can we put on a show? We'll bring the Bucci Brothers show. And Jess is like, sure. Sounds great. There's actually, if you look up Bucci Brothers acrobatic or fair on YouTube, and Bucci is Bucci, there's a great clip that Jess put of us doing our whole show, which is about 5 minutes long. And it was just so dumb, but it was really funny. for the crowd and for us just because it was so stupid. And we just sort of made it up that afternoon. And then, like out in San Bernardino on this big stage that we used to do Gonzago, and we also did the play that you and I were in, The Temptations of Fatty the Virgin Butcher. We used to do a variety show, and we would just think things up. Like we had one, I was the amazing Shandar, and I was a psychic, and Shannon would go out in the audience, and I'd have a blindfold, and he's like, I'm holding an object cupped in my hand. What is it, Shandar? And I'm like, you hold a Siamese cat. And he's like, no, Shandar, this object that is cupped is overflowing with liquid. And I'm like, you are holding a brick of lead. Like Shandar was just like the worst psychic. But I really appreciated those, and those were not even sort of step, we just kind of did those, and it was really fun to get to do silly stuff like that.
Did you guys have like a band or something?
Yeah, we had Jeff Stott was kind of a one-man band, and he played for Gonzago in the back. He had drums and noisemakers, and he'd punctuate the jokes like a penny whistle where you go, like just funny noises. And then he used to play at Jess's variety show, and he was great, because he had a whole setup and he played different sound effects and noises and things.
You've talked about the genesis of the Murder of Gonzago and sort of being parachuted into the cast. So contrast for me the difference between performing before a live audience, somewhat lubricated, as opposed to doing a video show that you're not quite sure if anybody's watching.
Yeah, with Gonzago, I felt like Gonzago was already road tested. It was already a play. It had already been, the kinks had been worked out. It was generally pretty funny. Like if you did it to the script with good actors, there were like lines that predictably got laughs. And we had really good actors. I mean, we had Dave Rudder and Dave Royal and Shannon. And really in that one, I was kind of a bit player. Like I was sort of the scruffy mascot, because I was just the narrator. I had one scene where I had this prop frog that had shaving cream in it, and I would hold it up and point at it, and the cream would fly out. And I mean, I had a laugh or two, but I was more just like in between scenes giving exposition. So it was an easy entry, right? Like I was coming into a play that already, and I was not carrying most of the weight. That was mostly like the Shannon character, the Queen, and the Lucianus character had all the lines. So that was a fairly easy one. Now, the other one that you and I did together with Mark Stellan and Shannon and a few others, The Temptation of Fatty the Virgin Butcher, we wrote that. I think Shannon and I wrote the first draft, then we gave it to you and Mark, and you guys kind of tinkered a little and we kind of agreed on it. And I remember we did a little trial run, before it was on stage, and our friends and some other fair people were laughing at it. Like we did a little bit of it and everyone was laughing and we're like, that's great. Like this is going to kill. And then I remember the first time we put it on stage, it just was like flatlining. Things we thought were funny were not funny. And the crowd was like, compared to a Gonzago crowd or a reduced Shakespeare crowd, the crowd was totally underwhelmed. And I remember, and I don't know if you remember this, Dan, we had this very tense emergency writing session at like a Denny's or something that night in San Bernardino where we're like, scratch that part. We got to put in a joke, put in something about boobs here. Yeah, that's good. And make this, we were just sort of like, we got to redo this thing, reboot it. And we rebooted it and brought it. And the next weekend it started getting laughs. And then we tuned it up more. And I had a much bigger role in that one. And that feeling of being up there and doing it is a horrible feeling. Like to do a joke and just get a laugh or two and then like keep going. I don't know if you remember all this, especially our tense writing redo that we did. I now look back on as a very funny moment.
Also looking back, what did you learn by failing and fixing things?
Wow. With the one that was failing, right? The Fatty the Virgin Butcher. It was the beginning of like a 6-week run of Faire. So short of quitting, and the play already had was already booked. It had stage time, right? Like it was like set up to do. It was kind of like the failure is not an option. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it was just like we got to fix this thing. And luckily there was enough kind of humorous stage experience by this point. And by this point I had done Gonzaga for years and had been on stage and kind of understood what the crowds were looking for. And Shannon was really good too. And you guys were, we were all, I don't want to say pros because that sounds kind of obnoxious, but we all knew kind of how it worked. So we had a lot to draw on to kind of come up with some jokes pretty quickly. So I don't know. I mean, if you wanted to say what the lesson is, it's kind of like I mean, this sounds really corny, but like better to light a candle than curse the darkness. That's kind of even when things get horrible, the way I deal with the stress, or depression or anxiety or whatever negative emotion you're having is like, okay, what can we do about this? Like, let's try this, let's try that. Let's like just kind of keep moving forward. And luckily in this case, it worked. I could see another scenario where like you try to do a bunch of stuff and it just fails even worse. But luckily we didn't have it. By the end of the run, Fatty was a pretty funny play, right? Like by the end of it, we got pretty predictable laughs and I think the crowd liked it. So it ended up working for us that time.
What I remember is that one of our strategies to make it better was to involve the audience more.
That's always good.
And that what I remember about the Fatty show was that for some reason we were able to recruit, or you were able to recruit a bunch of like washerwoman young
Yeah.
girls to come out as the barbarian tribe or something like that.
They were Fatty's temptresses.
Yes, that was it.
Yeah.
And that
And
worked.
they were
And
really, yeah, they were really funny and cute and vivacious. And then Fatty would like, oh, I'm gonna fight this. Yeah, that was all very funny.
but it
I
was
remember we had a lot of like exposition, like, and then crossing the bridge, I would, and we just cut all that out. Like just I think like less is more was another thing I learned. Like people are here to like set the jokes up, do the jokes, minimum amount of plot you need to kind of service the vehicle.
and that people like visual stuff
Yeah,
and they do not like exposition, especially if it has a veneer of periodicity.
totally.
Um,
If they can even hear it, right? Like people
yes.
even in the back could see some beautiful 17-year-old girl in a low cut top, tormenting Fatty. Like you could see that from the back and get the joke.
And
But
then you
like,
would stop and watch to see what happens next.
right, right. But like some flowery language or something like, I don't even know if the people in the back, they're talking to each other, like if they're even getting that. The visual
Precisely.
medium, you're right. Yeah. Like I remember there was the Purdue Shakespeare Company had a great bit where they did I forget which play, but they did it backward.
Yes.
And there was the scene where he was supposed to be drinking out of the cup and he would blow the liquid back, and that was just great. Like sight gags are great. Right. Yeah. The use of a prop, you know what I mean? Like just punctuating a point. Yeah. And things that are dumb too.
Right.
It's funny. This one neuroscientist said one of the ways to think of a joke is a joke is like a puzzle. And in the same way, when you do a puzzle, like when you watch a mystery and you figure it out and you go, oh, like that feeling. With
Yes.
a joke, you're doing that conceptually and you're doing it with language and you're setting things up one way. And then when the punchline comes, you realize, oh, it was something completely different all along. And that's funny. Like that's one of the ways things can be funny. I don't know if it explains all of them, but when you do like oob, there's just a moment where it's like, what? Oh, that's boo backward. Like it's just like a little boom.
And
Like that's
even
a
better,
great
let me
joke.
interrupt for a sec. I'm sorry. Because I love the oob joke,
Yeah.
but I love the fact it was set up like 15 minutes before when the ghost went boo.
Yeah,
And then
totally.
like 15 minutes later, you've completely forgotten, you
Right.
know, and then he I think it was Adam, and he put on the silly wig and and he's just running around like a maniac. But then he would stop and he would take a beat to set it up, and then the little thing would scroll down, and he went oob, but he wouldn't milk it. It was just like a throwaway. So
Yeah,
it really was dependent on the audience going, "Oh yeah, that's funny," and
yeah,
then
yeah.
I think oob is one of my favorite reduced Shakespeare,
It's a
and
great.
I've told them so to their face. So
Yeah, I'm sure they appreciated that. Classic.
it was classic. Well, I think before we started talking about how to keep the attention of the audience when the Queen show is going by and people are hawking their beer and there's a lot of things going on. So what are some of these stories you have about trying to keep the focus of the audience in an open air theater that's meant to be loud and immersive?
So one of them that was classic was the audience. If you picture the audience sitting, they're looking at the stage. Behind the stage we were on was a road. This is an agora. On the other little dirt road that people were walking back and forth on, and the people walking back and forth weren't distracting. Like sometimes they'd stop and kind of look, but they're looking at the back of the actors. You could keep the stage focus pretty easily. But on the other side of the road was the first aid booth, and they had a burlap door so that it was normally closed for privacy. And most of the time, hopefully, there wasn't a lot of first aid going on. But sometimes in the middle of the day, we'd be doing the show, we'd be in the middle of a scene, and you would hear this commotion coming down the road. And it would be like, get out of the way, move, clear, clear, clear. We got an emergency. And there would be like a senior citizen from Agura or something who was having heat stroke, like who'd been wandering around out in the hot sun, drinking beer or whatever, was having heat stroke. And they would just be and it was funny, the stretcher, they put burlap on the stretcher to try to make it. I'm like, we really don't need to worry about making the stretcher, period. But they did. So that you'd be on this little burlap stretcher with these silly first aid people kind of in costume, and this person like shaking, like they're going into convulsions right behind us, and they're lifting up this burlap door. And, Shannon would be out there in his dress going like, oh, do you find me attractive? Like you turn it up to like 11. And there's just sort of like what I learned from that is just sort of like the show goes on. You know what I mean? Like you just kind of like, and you'd see the people kind of looking at the guy having the convulsion and then looking back at Shannon, and just the idea like we couldn't stop and watch it. Like you had to kind of just keep doing what you were doing. So that was kind of like, I think the lesson from that is the show must go on. And just one other one that I thought
Wait,
of
can
in
I
this.
interrupt for a
Yeah,
second?
please.
We actually sort of dealt with that because our show was at 3 o'clock, I think, and
Hmm.
at 3:15 it would be guaranteed that the Queen would come by going to the Queen show.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I don't know if you remember how much noise they made because
Huge.
they're ringing the bells and they're drumming the drums and it's everything is God Save the Queen. And we kind of learned that we could not compete with that. So we just sort of gave up.
And just
And
took a break and
we
watched it with
said,
the
my
audience.
lords and ladies, we are fortunate today for it is our day to say hello to the Queen. Let us give forth a lusty God Save the Queen. So we literally did stop the show because the times we tried to power through and say, pay no attention to the Queen behind the curtain,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it just didn't work. I mean,
Well, one of the differences though is yours that was supposed to be in the narrative logic of what's going on at Fair. That was like the Queen was coming by. So in reality, if you were an actor at
oh
that
yeah,
time, you'd
okay, I
you'd be
see.
like, hey, here's the Queen. Whereas the person having heat stroke was like that was just not a planned thing, right?
You
Like
couldn't plan on it.
you couldn't work that into an Elizabethan, like, oh, did you have an ill humor from the potion you've taken? Like wouldn't have been appropriate to try to normalize it. And it was a lot quicker too. I mean, they kind of came by and then they went into the curtain, and you might hear a couple muffled groans, from behind the burlap, but it was pretty much over.
I'm sorry, I interrupted. Your second story was?
Oh, the second one's just like a little. I just remember one time, conventional wisdom is don't pay a lot of attention. Don't give the stage over to hecklers, right? If you've got someone in the audience who's being disruptive or something like. And generally, it wasn't a problem. Like the crowds were generally real nice people, and they were into what we were doing. But I remember one time there were two people sitting in the like front or second row, and they were just talking about really loud about just, well, I don't know, I'd like to get a hot dog too, but I mean, we already had one, and they're just planning their day out. And Shannon stopped and looked at him and said, "You're not watching TV." And then he went back into the play. And I just thought that was great. It's just like, this is a live thing. Like you're right in front of us. I always admired him for that.
One of the themes of this podcast is that the fair, as set up by Phyllis et al., was in the early 60s when there was a theater movement that did not acknowledge the fourth wall.
Right.
And that the premise of the fair was that everybody was here to have fun. And
Right.
that over time, I have learned that fair audiences were really well primed by everything about them, the whole environment, to have a good time. I mean, that message was given to them driving into the parking lot and as they wandered around fair. So I guess the question is, did you find that to be true, that the fair audiences were unusually forgiving and they weren't going to heckle they were there to have a good time and just enjoy whatever you were putting out there?
Yeah, I think that's a generally like a very true statement. They were nice people, and they did. They wanted to have fun. I mean, it's a pretty specific thing you're going to see. If you go to a Renaissance fair, it's not like you're going to like a county fair where it's like, oh, I don't know, maybe I'll see a cow or have an ice cream cone or see how they grow corn. Like what you're getting into. It's a specific thing. It's like people who go see Star Wars movies. You know what I mean? Like they're inclined to want to dig what the franchise is giving them. And I felt like that they were nice. Sometimes the only thing I would say is sometimes late in the day you might get people who had a little too much to drink. But if you were doing a comedy that was kind of bawdy and physical and easy to follow, they were down for that too, and they would just laugh loud, or you could manage them.
I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about how being a successful performer out at fair has influenced you after you left fair. Now, I'm assuming you still are not doing Renaissance fairs.
No, I don't.
What has your post-fair career consisted of?
I'm a health and safety manager, so I manage corporate safety programs for a biotech pharma company, global company.
How has your fair experience informed your subsequent career?
And let me throw in one other thing. I have a second job. I teach. I'm an adjunct faculty professor at Cal State Northridge, and I teach a graduate level class in health and safety as well. I would say, I don't know if I can draw some great corollary. I'm not the greatest public speaker let me put it this way, in a venue like you and I are having, where we can just kind of set our own parameters.
Mm-hmm.
I'm real comfortable communicating and I enjoy it. And I think I'm generally a pretty funny guy to talk with. If it's like, oh, say it this way, but don't say it that way. And, don't talk about this. Like the more parameters you start putting on it, it doesn't work for me. Like I kind of vapor lock, like it just kind of cramps my style. So I liked fair, like what you were saying earlier about like you had kind of a structure, but there was a lot of latitude to improvise and kind of put your own stamp on it. So it would be nice to say being on stage made me this incredible public speaker, but the public speaking that a lot of times you have to do in the corporate world, in my experience, is more like being kind of a politician. Where you can't say what you just want to say, the obvious thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that it's opened a billion doors for me. But one thing I will say is that, both in my teaching and when I've done training or if I'm running a meeting or trying to convince people to do something, I do feel like humor is a great way to get people to chill out a little bit. And just, you know what I mean? Telling a joke or just saying something to get everyone to kind of let their guard down a little bit. And I use humor a lot in teaching and I try to use it at work as well. And I think that is something that, kind of in the fair, like I was saying when we did our play the first time and it bombed, you know what I mean? It's like put some jokes in there. You never went wrong making people laugh, even at like a funeral, right? Like when someone's giving a eulogy, it's great if there's a moment where they tell a funny story about the person.
Right.
Like you can always find some way to appeal to that in people.
One thing I learned out at Fair was, if possible, connect with the audience before the show starts.
Mm, yeah. No, that's a really good point. Like, this is just like weird corporate memory. There was this guy that I quite liked, this European guy who was like a VP or something. He was a pretty heavy hitter. But I went to a meeting with him and he would sort of start, yeah, the French cuisine, I think it's better in Belgium than French. Like he'd kind of get everybody talking and then he'd say, well, so the test results we had that came back negative. And it was almost like he got everybody in a conversation and sort of pulled them in. And then it started. It was like a soft start. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
before you knew it, you were actually doing work, but everyone was like chill. And that's almost kind of what you're describing, like a little banter with the audience instead of like a cold start to a play or a performance is kind of nice because it gives everyone a chance to kind of get aboard and it isn't so do or die, like everyone kind of comes in a little bit.
Thing.
I mean, somebody said once to me, and again, like I'm not like some great actor with like a lot of acting lessons or whatever. So this is probably said to everybody, but it's like the audience wants to be on your side.
Yes.
Like they don't want to see you fail. They want to have fun. They want to see you succeed. That they want to have the experience of seeing a good show and seeing you do
And or
your
learning
thing.
something.
Yeah, and just having a experience with you. So that's another thing to kind of realize is like they're pulling for you generally. Like every now and then you get someone who's a jerk, but that's really way more the exception than the rule.
And that's basically the audience at Fair. They want to have a good time.
Yeah,
They
totally.
haven't driven 50 to 100 miles and then slog through all the heat and the dust to then sit and be bored.
Yeah, right. They want the thing that they want that they came for.
Another part of your resume that you have not mentioned is that you're an author.
Yes, and I've been on your Authors Read podcast. Thank you.
What lessons of creativity in your authorship can you attribute to being out at Fair?
Hey, I don't know if I draw a real straight line that way. I mean, it's interesting when you say that though, because when you asked me what I remembered about Fair, all my descriptions were sort of physical descriptions of things and tastes and smells and sounds and things like that. It's funny. There's a really good book on, or I think it's a really good book. Stephen King wrote a book on writing called Stephen King on Writing. He said, when you set a scene, you want to describe it in general. So like I'm going into a roadhouse bar. And then he said, you want to give a detail or two that's real specific. People kind of already have an idea what a roadhouse bar is like. So that's good. And then give a detail or two to kind of personalize it, make it a little richer. Like maybe there's a jukebox in the corner that one of the lights is flickering because it's so old, like the neon is going on and off, or there's a smell or the sound of a train behind it. And he said, and that's all you need, is just drop in a few poignant details and then go on. You've set that scene and their imagination will take over from there. I feel like when I was describing Fair to you, I was kind of doing that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like I would say that in writing, picking a few visual or sensory things and kind of dropping them in is, whereas if you read, there's other writers where it's all just dialogue and plot and they don't do that as much. It doesn't really answer your question, but that's what came to me.
I remember in the other podcast we did, you mentioned that like Jess gave you some feedback on, I believe it was your first book,
Hmm.
and that, so I was kind of going for, you made creative connections at Fair that you have utilized later in life. Would you they say that is true?
Oh yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah, there's a lot of people I know, Jess and Sandy, and kind of by extension, some of the people from their crowd I met through Fair. And yeah, he was helpful when I was learning to write, because he's an accomplished writer. And, it's almost like when you meet someone who's good at what they do, there's usually three or four fundamental lessons they can just tell. You know what I mean? Like, hey, kid, come here. Like, let me point this out. Like, so Jess is one that I talked about on your other podcast. Was I had my first draft of my novel had a lot of meandering. They were fun. Like I thought they were well written, but then this happened, and almost be like dropping a whole short story into the novel. And Jess said that you have to be willing to kill your children. Like you can't say, "Oh, but I love that so much. I can't."
Right.
It's like it doesn't move the plot forward. This is a story about a road trip going from here to there. Like get them there. You can't have 90 pages of like a little sideline where they stop and find a pot farm in Northern California and run into a bunch of deadheads. Great little short story, but take it out of the novel. So he taught me that. That's really helpful. Like anything that doesn't pull the story forward, you got to throw it overboard, even if you love it.
Are there other creative connections you made at Fair that you have maintained?
It's funny, all the people as you get older, right? When you think about it, because I mean, and don't take this the wrong way, Dan, but I don't sit around and think about, like, I wonder what Dan's up to a lot, because I've got a teenage son and I've got my own life going. But then we get to talking about this stuff, even talking about Fair. I'm like, yeah, it was like a lot of stuff went on there. I met a lot of people. Like it was a very rich environment. And, I mean, this is going to sound like old cranky man stuff, but there was no social media. Everyone wasn't carrying around a phone. I mean, people were making, you were in the physical world and you were making face-to-face connections with people, which are both really powerful things that have kind of maybe not as prevalent as they should be nowadays. We went and saw my son and I went and saw David Gilmour was at the Hollywood Bowl. And before the show, the bassist came out and said, "Hey, it's great to see everybody showed up," and, said a lot of nice things. He goes, "Everybody in the band, David especially, like when we look out on the crowd, if we see a bunch of phones being held up," he goes, "it's such a downer and it's so distracting, all these little squares of light, and we can't see your faces. We don't know." He said, "Just don't do it." He goes, "If you want to take a picture or take 10 seconds of video, that's fine, but please don't stand there. You'll get a way better show for you and for us." And I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, and true.
Yeah, totally true. I know. Yeah, people record whole things. I'm like, are you really going to watch this again? You know what I mean? Like just enjoy it and then you can remember it. Like
Well,
it's
I've
not
seen videos of Fair people just walking around, and it just doesn't capture the totality
the
of the experience.
physicality of it. Yeah. Yeah. It's a very physical experience because it's hot. You're sitting on hay bales. It's dusty. You're eating and drinking. It's loud. Like it's very physical. That's kind of what I like about it. It's kind of like camping almost.
I actually remember sort of my feet at Fair because I wore the Kung Fu slippers.
Yeah, me too.
And after a while, they got hot, and
Dusty and gross.
yeah, and that's the 10,000th rock I've stepped on
Totally.
today.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about those shoes. One time, so I would sort of throughout the play when we did Gonzago, I had a little spot where I sat over on the side of the stage and just kind of watched, and then I would bound onto the stage, make my whatever, speech, and then bounce off, and the actors would. I wasn't backstage, whereas the
Right.
rest of them would go backstage when they weren't on. I was always visible to the audience. One time I went to bound on stage with the little kung fu slippers, which are basically just like wrapping your foot in gauze, putting a little cardboard on the bottom of it. I went to jump and hit my big toenail straight on full bore on the edge of the stage. And it was like a bolt of, I mean, like a Guantanamo Bay, like tactics, like just a bolt of pain. And I was like, the king, furthermore. I just had to do it was another show must go on. But I just remembered that when you talked about the shoes, like I just had to do the line and I kind of limped off.
When you were talking about, I was often the narrator in my shows or our shows as well.
Hmm.
And I sort of saw it, my role is I was there to be the salesman for the show from the cast to the audience. And so my job, aren't we all having fun? Let's move things along kind of thing.
Hmm.
How did you conceptualize your role as the narrator?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it. Like everyone was like, "Oh, here's that funny little man." Like, I didn't really have great, like other than I had my frog gag, and I had like a couplet or like a little poem that I did at the end that I think was sort of grafted from Midsummer Night's Dream, and it was, "If we actors have offended, think but this," and then everyone was behind me while I was doing it, so it was kind of a nice moment. Like I was in front, and they were all like kind of in a line behind me. "If we actors have offended, think but this," and then they'd all say, "We're all demented." And then it said, "Although our play had little plot, we gave it even less of thought." And I don't remember the rest of it, but that was sort of a moment. Like I got the final,
Right.
and then we all bowed. And so that was a nice, but other than that and the frog, I didn't get a lot of, I was more just like, "Oh, here's that." And I'd just be like, "And meanwhile, in the Queen's castle, the plot thickens." Just a little exposition.
And you gave people a chance to take another sip of their beer without losing focus.
Yeah, I was almost like an infomercial and you go get, go out
Right.
and get a snack from the kitchen real quick.
Yeah, that was clearly my job as well. I mean,
I was the
you
low man on the totem pole. Let's put
you
it that way.
you don't have to really pay attention to what I say because the important stuff is coming up.
Yeah, I didn't say much either. I didn't have many. A lot of times it was like a line or two.
Well, you learn real quick that the more you talk, the more people sort of zoom out. You start losing the focus if you just have this long exposition. The
Yeah.
only time long exposition works is if you're Adam Long.
Hmm.
In the King Arthur show, he had a couple long poems and he would just go nuts. And after a while, it became clear that people weren't paying attention to the actual words themselves, except for the words that rhymed with each other, but that he was just such had a manic energy about him that,
Hmm.
and we also had something going on while he was doing the exposition.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, he was good. I mean, he was sort of built for fare. All those reduced Shakespeare guys were kind of the yardstick everyone was trying to live up to.
Who else at Fair do you remember as being good or enjoyable?
I mean, that's about it. Like I kind of hung out in my own little zone. I liked them. I liked the variety shows. I thought those were a lot of fun. I mean, there were a lot of, I was a younger single man. There were a lot of beautiful women hawking stuff all up and down the streets that were kind of amazing to look at and were sort of at the top of their, feline power. Like, and they were just a sight to behold. That was kind of great. And, and the musicians were really good, like being able to play those like loots and you know what I
Mhm.
mean? You'd see someone going by and it's like it takes a lot of skill to do that. It's not just some little thing you set and it's not a prop, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of
Right.
talent behind that.
And that added to the otherness of this village kind of
Yeah,
thing.
it made it real. Yeah.
Did you have favorite food?
I drank a lot of beer. I sort of started a drink that I still drink today, which is a glass of beer with like a quarter shot of whiskey in it to give a little kick. Like I learned that at Gonzago. As far as food, they made like the bangers, like the
Right.
banger with mustard and onions was fantastic. I remember there was meat pie you could get that was really good. Jillian and Beth Hathaway and Jillian had a trifle booth that we used to hang out at sometimes, and they made really nice desserts. So yeah, those were all good. I mean, everything was really pretty good. I felt like they made meat pies, and I remember they made one that was just cheese,
A
like
lot
just
of
kind of
people have mentioned this old cheese pies. Yes.
totally great, and also just eating a corn on the cob with lots of salt and melted butter on it. That was kind of a classic.
I'm going to switch gears again and give you some counterfactuals or role plays. So let's say you have a niece. Let's call her Zoe. She's 14 and it's Thanksgiving. And at the dinner table, Zoe declares, I want to do the Renaissance Fair next spring. Look at Uncle Dave. He did fair and has all these great stories. I want to be just like Uncle Dave. Your sister, Zoe's mom, puts down her fork and in a very precise voice says, Yes, Uncle Dave, why should I let my daughter, the apple of my eye, do fair? And you say,
Well, 15 might be a little young, you know, but that would be sort of my only qualifier on it. I think it's a great experience. I would totally encourage people to do it. It's creative. Just kids today, right? Like doing stuff in the physical world, as opposed to doing something on an app or a video game or sitting at a desk with a computer. Like my son, anything he wants to ride a mountain bike, plays guitar, um, he does drama, like anything that involves sort of getting out and having to interact with people in the physical world, I'm generally pro for with kids. I think, the for a 15-year-old, I would probably be like, you can do the fair, but you're not staying over or sleeping over at the fair. I think that's you got to be over 18 for that one. That would be my only caveat.
Okay, okay, this one here is a counterfactual. In a world that the fair does not exist, how would your life have been different?
You know, I think it would have largely resembled what it is. It would have just been a little less rich. You talking about all this is kind of making me, I don't think I'm was ever as much of a fair person as maybe some of the other people you have on your podcast. I was kind of the accidental actor. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like I kind of just got pulled into it and then it ended up being a lot of fun. But I am getting really nostalgic talking about it and kind of as you're bringing all these things up, having these different memories. And it would be sad to not have all that. And the other weird, like our crazy writing session that we had after the fair in San Bernardino and creepy hotel that I stayed at when I didn't want to sleep at the fair. All the ancillary experiences that go along with it that are just funny memories too.
When you were kind enough to say, sure, I'll do an interview with you, Dan, did your brain say, be sure you mention XYZ and we haven't mentioned XYZ? So this is your time to fill in the blank.
The only other story, and this is just brief little story, was one of our final shows of Gonzaga. I don't know if it was the final one of the year and fair was closing down or final one in a girl, but whatever. We did it, and some of our fans that we had this sort of like some people who were like a groupie wouldn't be the right term, but they were just sort of they showed up for all the shows, especially later in the day. Got a kick out of it. They wanted to honor us or do something funny, and since the potato is a big piece of the story, like this poison potato, they decided to throw potatoes at us while we were on stage. And like, I get the symbolism, but I got hit with one of them. I got hit in the chest. It was like getting hit with a rock. And then Shannon got hit, I think, on the side of the face with one and kind of just kept powering through. And then I remember afterwards, we're like, what were you throwing potatoes? Good God. Someone got hit in the mouth. So think through your props that you're using to make a point, I think would be my because I don't think they meant to injure us, but the guy, I forget who it was, who got hit on the tooth with the potato. Like it wasn't a pretty big uncooked potato, it wasn't a pretty picture. So that's the only story that is would have been left on the table if we didn't get that one out there.
Well, I think that's a great spot to stop recording. Do not injure the actors.
Thank you for having me on, Dan.
It's been, I've enjoyed every moment of it, aside from being. And that's my November 2024 interview with Dave Bueche. I've been your host, Dan McLaughlin, and this has been another episode of Faire Folk at Work. If you would like me to pass along any questions or comments to Dave, please contact me at djng@earthlink.net. Questions or comments about the podcast itself can also be sent to me at djng@earthlink.net. Finally, if you or somebody you know would like to be a guest on Faire Folk at Work, email me at djng@earthlink.net. But that's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.